So welcome everyone. It's so good to see you by the wonders of technology. So today we're joining together virtually to hear of the good research of 4 of our PhD graduates that they've completed over the past several years. And I so wish we could be together in person to hear about their studies. And we particularly wish we could be in person to celebrate with these graduates and their families and friends with a hooding ceremony. We hope that will all happen in January, and we'll be praying toward that end. But through technology, I think more of us can participate today, including friends, family, alumni, other guests. And we are recording the session, so it will be a memento for our graduates to keep as a reminder of this day. So today we feature and celebrate the research these 4 students have spent years working on. Research that is rigorous, that integrates theory and practice, that is applicable to the issues facing higher education, and that we hope makes a difference in the world. That's where our heart is at APU, cultivating difference makers. We care deeply for our students as persons, as well as future scholars and leaders, and it's our desire to help them realize who God has designed them to be and to equip them to do the work that God has called them to do. Now, we could not pull off an event such as this without the tireless dedication and creativity of our staff. And so a huge thank you to Lacey Tanis, who's our doctoral programs coordinator, and we'll be facilitating some of the technology today, and to Estrella Cruz, who is the coordinator of our master's program. Both Lacey and Estrella have been instrumental with the logistics and the technology today, so anything that goes right is due to them, and anything that goes wrong is totally me. So here's how we're going to do this. We have 4 presenters, and so each presenter will be introduced by their dissertation committee chair, and then we'll have about 12 minutes to share their dissertation findings. And then after each presentation, we will take 5 or 6 minutes for questions from the audience. Now, to ask a question, you're going to use the chat feature. We want everybody muted except the person presenting. So if you have a question, type the question in the chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Lacey and I will both be monitoring that, and Lacey will then facilitate those questions. She will field the questions to the presenter for 5 or 6 minutes. Then she will turn it over to the next student's dissertation chair, who will introduce their person. Okay, so that's how we're going to do that. And so now we will get started. Our very first presenter is David Dufault Hunter, or DDH, as we affectionately call him. DDH is a member of the 2013 cohort and is currently the Director of Admissions and Records at Cal State Northridge. What I've loved about working with DDH over the years on my research team and throughout the dissertation process has been his relentless determination to master structural equation modeling and his deep desire to understand the students behind the numbers. He has a passion for students who are systemically disadvantaged by a biased admissions testing process, and his dissertation studied the role of the institution and its structures and policies in college student thriving. He's done a brilliant study, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you. Take it away, DDH.
Hey, everybody. Let me share my screen here. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen?
You're good.
Good. Well, hopefully my face won't freeze. If my computer freezes up, I apologize for whatever look is on my face. But it's great to be with you today. So in the next 12 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick overview of my project. I'm going to highlight some of the most interesting findings, discuss several implications, and talk about a few areas for future research. So let me start with identifying the problem that provides the context for this study. Unfortunately, higher education in the United States has reinforced rather than reversed social inequity. Students with access to social and financial capital continue to attend and graduate from colleges and universities with significantly higher student success outcomes and employability rates, while students with fewer resources are more likely to enroll at less selective institutions with limited funds or academic support. So how does this happen? Well, admission practices contribute to the disproportionate relegation of academically underserved students into institutions with low retention and graduation rates. Colleges and universities tend to rely on student entry characteristics such as high school GPA and standardized test scores to identify academically talented students because these variables consistently predict future retention and graduation rates. However, these attributes more accurately reflect the type of education to which students have access. A racialized K-12 academic system relegates many underrepresented minorities to poorly resourced school districts without the necessary tools to adequately prepare students to meet the academic criteria necessary to attend selective or highly selective institutions. The inability of institutions to address social inequity by providing access and support to historically academically underserved populations not only represents a moral failure. Pragmatically, underrepresented minority students represent the fastest growing college-age population in the United States. According to George Koo, the majority of future jobs will require employees to have a college degree. Our economy depends on a demographic dividend whereby younger workers replace older workers, and those younger workers are by and large underrepresented minorities. Therefore, we have an ethical and economic problem, persistent social inequity that threatens our economic well-being. So what do student success models tell us about this problem? Traditional models of student success help us understand multiple variables: academic preparation, social and academic integration, organizational characteristics, and financial components, and how they interact to influence student success. However, these models tend to rely on student entry characteristics such as the primary predictors of student persistence and graduation rates. These models consistently show that students who enter college with higher GPAs and standardized test scores will persist and graduate at higher rates. Thus, pre-college attributes rather than campus conditions determine student success. The data are also clear that student success differs by institution type, and I mean 2-year versus 4-year institutions, private, public, selective, less selective. However, once student entry characteristics enter the equation, institution type becomes less predictive. Student thriving, on the other hand, represents a holistic approach to student success that integrates the understanding gained in the traditional models of student persistence with psychological and psychosocial models. More importantly, student thriving is not correlated to student entry characteristics like high school GPA or standardized tests or demographics. Institutions can create conditions in which students thrive regardless of their background. As a theoretical framework designed to evaluate academic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal aspects of the student's experience on campus, thriving represents an expanded, tested, and reliable measure of student success. So what's the gap? Well, we know that student characteristics do not influence the variation in thriving. What we did not know prior to this study was whether thriving levels varied by institution type. Again, private, public, 2-year, 4-year. And we didn't know if student pathways to thriving differed by institution type, meaning if I attend a private institution, are there more pathways available to me to thrive than if I attend a public institution? The significance of this study is if the type of institution a student attends does not predict thriving, then institutions can create campus conditions where a broad array of students can thrive irrespective of their pre-college characteristics. This means that well-resourced, highly selective institutions can admit and successfully educate students from underserved communities, and less selected universities that perhaps have limited funds can create campus conditions that create increased student success. Two research questions guided my study. The first is, to what extent do institutional characteristics, really trying to get at, does institution type, when you consider campus conditions, how do they relate to predict variation in student thriving? And then the second question is, are there differences by institution type in terms of the pathways that are available to students for student thriving? To address this question, or these questions, I use correlational design because I was interested in exploring the relationships among the variables that contribute to thriving. The data for the study came from the Thriving Project, and the data were collected from undergraduate students in fall 16, 17, and fall 18. And once I completed all the data screening, 18,440 records remain, so it's a robust data set. White females who attended private colleges, generally non-first gen, represent the majority of the sample. So there are 6 findings. I want to briefly talk about 3. And probably the most important finding in this study is that campus experiences determine whether students thrive. So regardless of institution type and independent of student pre-college characteristics, colleges and universities either inhibit or facilitate the conditions that influence student thriving, particularly for those who have been historically underserved academically. This is a pretty big one. This means that I can go, regardless of whether I go to a selective institution or a less selective institution, an institution that's has more funding for academic support or less support, it is the conditions on campus that determine my thriving, not the kind of institution I attend. Now, how do colleges, universities create conditions? Well, there are a number of different variables. The one that I want to talk about is something called valuing difference. And one of the most important campus experiences happens in the classroom. And in my study, the sensitivity of faculty to students from diverse backgrounds and the ability of faculty to facilitate open and honest discussion that includes multiple points of view appears to be a powerful influencer of thriving, as well as other influential variables like psychological sense of community, which is not just sense of belonging, but also involves students feeling like they can contribute to that community. Something called institutional integrity, which is an idea that the degree to which students feel satisfied that the institution is keeping its promises. And then spirituality, which is the ability of students, or the sense of students, to have a transcendent purpose for their life, and that transcendent purpose allows them and helps them navigate the obstacles that they encounter in college. The other finding I want to talk about is something called major certainty. And major certainty directly contributes to student thriving. When students are certain about their major, they're more satisfied with their experiences in the classroom and find it easier to establish and maintain connections with peers. This makes sense. When we share common interests with others, we are more likely to find value alignment as well, and that creates a rich environment for friendship and connection. So I identified 3 primary implications. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. And let me talk about emphasizing the influence of valuing difference. So the quantity and quality of student-faculty interaction influences multiple dimensions of a student's experience on campus. As agents of socialization, faculty members have the opportunity and responsibility to enable students to experience greater levels of spirituality, psychological sense of community, satisfaction with the institution, and ultimately thriving. Given the powerful influence valuing differences has on the multiple pathways of student thriving, institutional leaders should consider 3 steps to enhance the classroom experience. First, raise institutional awareness across the board about the power of valuing difference. Second, identify prospective faculty members who, in the hiring process, who either reflect a capacity to value difference or demonstrate potential to develop the ability to incorporate multiple perspectives and diverse points of view in their curriculum, assignments, and presentations. And finally, incorporate the elements of valuing difference into faculty development programs that focus on teaching and learning. The other piece that I want to focus on is major certainty. So the importance of identifying and pursuing academic goals as an element of college student success can't be overstated. Students who do not accumulate enough credits in their first year and fail to declare a major are at a significant risk of departure from college. The lack of clarity or guidance related to major selection can result in increased time to graduate, additional tuition expenses, or early departure from college. Most institutions offer an array of academic offerings without providing relevant advisement or structure to assist students in selecting a major from an overwhelming number of options. The role of advising becomes vital in helping students not only select an appropriate major, but thrive in college. By creating guided pathways or meta majors, institutions can limit the number of choices students have to consider in making a major or degree selection, while giving them options to explore without wasting class credits. For those of you considering a quantitative study, let me highlight just one of the 5 areas I identified for future research. The literature consistently shows differences in retention and graduation rates when comparing 2- and 4-year institutions. The data set I use did not include enough 2-year institutions to do an analysis. And although I predict that campus experiences continue to account for the majority of variation, even among between 2- and 4-year institutions, there may be differences in the number of pathways to thriving. So if you take anything away from this presentation, I hope you'll hear 2 things. First, students can thrive on any campus when faculty, staff, and administrators can commit themselves to creating campus conditions that promote student thriving. Secondly, it matters what happens in the classroom, and it's not just that there are enough faculty or student-faculty interactions. There's a qualitative component, and that valuing difference, our ability to hear and respect one another, especially when we disagree, significantly and positively contributes to student thriving. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dufault Hunter, for that excellent presentation. Seeing some applause hands, some reactions here. I'll add mine as well. Great job. We do have some questions coming in. First one I would like to send your way. Can you share the differences of the 2- and 4-year institutions? So maybe teasing that differentiation out a little bit in your research.
Well, I wish I could. That was the one area that I couldn't analyze because I didn't have enough records in the 2-year institution. I have plenty in the 4-year, but the 2-year institutions, we don't have enough thriving data to do a structural equation modeling analysis. And that's why it needs to be, it's something that I think should absolutely be taken up by one of you and explored more fully. What I would say, there is one study done by a former or an alumni of our program, and she did find that students at her community college thrived at higher levels than national numbers in terms of thriving. So, you know, I think it'll be an interesting sort of analysis to do because, as I said, it will depend on the campus conditions that an institution creates.
Thank you. If anyone has a follow-up for a question that they ask, feel free to send that to me in the chat as well. I have a question from Dr. Jones-Jolivet for you. How on this side of your study are you as a researcher contending with the rampant conditions of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and settler colonial violence that are wedded directly to institutions of higher education?
Well, don't hold back, Tabitha, in terms of a big old question for me.
Oh, you got this, right, David? Come through. I want to hear you. I want to hear you talk. Thank you.
You got it.
Thanks for your presentation.
You're welcome. Well, I think from my role as a person who is responsible for evaluating students for admission into a university, I need to be cognizant and aware of how those different components that we use in the admission process disproportionately impact students who have been historically either excluded or discouraged from attending a university, in this case, like Cal State Northridge. And so I have to be very aware and do my research in terms of understanding what those components are. So for me, and Lori mentioned this in the introduction, the generalized use of standardized tests in higher education to admit students into universities is problematic, not because they necessarily don't measure things that we think they measure or that they're biased. They are problematic because they do measure academic skill that students must have. They must have access to developing those skills at the K through 12 level. And it assumes that everybody has the same exact access to those resources, and they do not. And so institutions like CSUN not only have to identify admission standards that account for that difference, but also create conditions in the classroom and on campus that help students develop the skills they need to be successful moving forward and graduate from their universities.
Thank you. Another question for you. What are some long-held assumptions in the field of higher education that, in your opinion, your findings disrupt?
Well, I only have like 3 minutes left, so let me just say this. I think that really since the 80s, higher education has moved toward moving almost exclusively or focusing almost exclusively on talent identification. And this is something that Aston identified in his Are You Smart Enough? And that talent identification, meaning do you have enough, do you have a high enough GPA and high enough standardized tests? And we describe that as the quality of the incoming class. That's quality. And so our focus is on talent identification, because then it identifies and it raises the reputation of the institution based on who's coming in, not on who's going out. And I want to say that part of what this study suggests is that we need to be focused on talent development. That our responsibility as higher education administrators and educators and professionals is to realize that our task is to take somebody where they are, that they have academic talent. It may not show in these traditional criteria that we use, but they have academic talent. We can measure, are you prepared enough to begin pursuing a degree in higher education? Then it's our responsibility to create those conditions that allow them to develop those talents into strengths so that they can then be successful, not only in college, but then as they move forward in their careers.
Thank you. One last very short question. Do you have a tip for anyone who seeks to follow in your footsteps and master the art of structural equation modeling? One tip.
YouTube, baby. I don't know how many hours and hours and hours of YouTube.
Thank you. Let's give another virtual round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Dufault Hunter. We're going to transition now. I want to introduce Dr. Alex Junn, who will be introducing us to our next presenter.
Thank you, Lacey. Friends, it's good to see you all here, and it is a treat for me to share with you and introduce Dr. Redgina Hill. Redgina is the Executive Director of Inclusion and Equity at St. Mary's College, and she's also the founder and CEO of Redgina Hill Consulting. Redgina has been a valuable member of my research team, and we have recently published an article on anti-racism in higher education in the Journal of Race and Pedagogy. Her dissertation, which we'll get to hear a little bit today, is entitled Chief Abolitionist Officers: an exploration of the lived experiences of Black Chief Diversity Officers at dominantly white Christian institutions. Never has this topic been more necessary or timely. I'm blessed to know her and honored to have served as her chair. So friends, without any further ado, Dr. Redgina Hill.
Thank you. Allow me a second to transition into my slides. Can you all see it? Great. I'm going to talk a little bit fast through these first couple of slides so I can get to the good stuff. As Dr. John mentioned, my research is titled Chief Abolitionist Officers: An Exploration of the Lived Experiences of Black Chief Diversity Officers at Dominantly White Christian Institutions. Over the past couple of years, and most recently with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and even within my own community, Eric Logan, public forms of racism and anti-Blackness has been on display in society and by extension, higher education. As a means to address racism, higher education administrators have hired chief diversity officers to centralize diversity efforts and focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Little is known about the lived experiences of chief diversity officers, and research is even more limited on the experiences of Black chief diversity officers. The purpose of the study is to understand the experiences of Black chief diversity officers who are fighting against racism and systems of oppression. My research question is as follows: what are the lived experiences of Black chief diversity officers at dominantly white Christian institutions? And it's important to note that in my study, I use the word dominant white and dominant white Christian interchangeably because there's very little difference. It's the whiteness that is dominant. I chose a hermeneutic phenomenology as my methodological approach because it is not only a description, but it is an exercise in which I was able to create meaning surrounding the lived and shared experiences of Black chief diversity officers. With this approach, I was also able to honor the voices of my participants as their narratives aligned across dominantly white institutions. Also, this approach was important to me because it did not require me to deny myself or separate myself from the research. It welcomed me and my experience as a Black woman, as a Christian, and as a chief diversity officer. It gave me the freedom to bring my unique historical, social, political perspectives to the study. And it also challenged me in so many ways and called me deeper into the process to embrace my own biases and experiences as a Black chief diversity officer. Here's a snapshot of my approach. I interviewed 5 Black chief diversity officers, 3 women, 2 men, and they were from CCCU institutions across the US. I utilized a semi-structured interview approach. I interviewed participants 3 times for a total of 15 interviews lasting 60 to 75 minutes. I also changed the names of my participants to protect their identities. And this is where I'll slow down just a little bit because this is the good stuff. So the overarching theme that emerged from the data is the art of balance. And within this theme, there were 4 sub-themes that emerged, which are the oscillation of voice, privilege, purpose, and emotions. As the overarching theme, participants told compelling stories depicting a balancing act that all had to navigate when describing their experiences. There's this delicate balance that Black chief diversity officers must navigate in order to create change within a system that has functioned like a well-oiled machine for centuries and was not designed for them to hold positions of power. One participant described this as the balancing act of oscillating between 2 spaces. In my study, oscillation is the emotional movement of back and forth between 2 opposing states. It's the highs and the lows, the victories and defeats, the authenticity and censorship, and the purpose and the unwritten expectation of the role of chief diversity officers. This is what one of my participants, James, had to say about these range of emotions, and I'll just highlight just a portion of this quote. He says, moments where you are feeling fully empowered and on top of your game, and then the momentum is moving in the right direction, and it's ordained in the right thing to do. And then there's the other moments where it's like, man, I really got to slow down and explain the importance of this work to people. It is within this quote that the oscillation served as a key component for my sub-themes. I'm only going to highlight 2 of my sub-themes. The first one I would like to bring your attention to is the oscillation of emotions. And this is the everyday emotional shift Black Chief Diversity Officers manage in order to handle the stress of their role. Participants spoke to factors such as the social and political climate that has impacted their position, which caused them to move between positive and negative feelings to find their place of solace. They also express how their role can be emotionally taxing when dealing with these factors and the impacts that they have on their personal lives. Here's a quote from one of my participants, and I will just highlight a portion of it. Nina says, if I sense that I am not in a space because I am being triggered or I am being overwhelmed, I have permission from my president to say, I can't do it today. If I don't take care of myself, no one else is going to take care of me. Several of my participants spoke to the importance of self-care and wanting to call in Black due to the emotional triggers and toll of being a Black Chief Diversity Officer. The second sub-theme that I would like to highlight is the oscillation of privilege. And this is recognizing the position of privilege the CDO role carries while managing the expectations of some who view individuals in this role as key players as an oppressive system. These CDOs have a seat at the table, they have access, they have position and money, and majority of my participants are in inaugural positions. They also feel marginalized in their privileged positions, causing them to search for acceptance and belonging. These are all things that make their work more complicated. Here's a quote from another participant. I'll just highlight a portion of it. She says, it's really hard to now be cast as on the side of the oppressor. Privilege is a funny thing. I can be privileged in one regard, and then at the end of the day, folks don't see what my leadership dynamics look like. They don't know how marginalized I remain in that space. And then when I walk out of that space, it's like, where's my community? Where can I find space of acceptance? All of my participants described feeling empowered and grateful to have a seat at the table where policies were shaped and they had a voice to create space for those who were marginalized. What Angela described is the essence of why my participants experience oscillation of privilege, is because on one hand, they are privileged and on the other hand, they are viewed as the man. The overarching theme of my study, the art of balance, caused participants to oscillate between 2 opposing spaces. The weight that comes along with being a Black Chief Diversity Officer is due to the daily battles of trying to conquer the deep-seated white supremacy within higher education and society. Because higher education has been built on white supremacist ideologies, the use of Black bodies as tools to maintain dominance is not new. Black Chief Diversity Officers are reminiscent to Black overseers on plantations, and the position can be regulated as overseers on the academic plantation charged with keeping students of color from protesting and used for symbolic display with no real authority. So after weeks of wrestling with this realization and sitting with the data, the Oscillation Spectrum was birthed. It is a 3-pronged oscillation continuum displaying the difference of structural diversity to minimal allowable systemic and structural change to finally the dismantlement of white supremacy. The role of a Chief Diversity Officer is complicated and it can be exhausting moving across this continuum. So allow me to break it down for you really fast. The first benchmark represents those Chief Diversity Officers who have been hired for compositional diversity. These are the head Negroes in charge. They are the window dressings for our institution's outward commitment to diversity. They are charged with not creating change, but keeping peace. Some are satisfied with maintaining the status quo and will stay at their institutions because of the salary and dependency on the system. Others will move across the continuum and experience frustration when they are met with resistance trying to create change. The second benchmark represents where a majority of chief diversity officers find themselves on a continuum. These are the chief absolution officers. They are the fixers used to ease the guilt experienced by white organizational leaders for permitting a racist environment. Dominant white leadership instructs CDOs at this level to make tolerable change within certain parameters. At this point of the continuum, chief diversity officers have accepted the fact that by working within the system, they can make change and create space for others by recognizing they are working within a system built on white supremacy. Knowing this, chief diversity officers can make huge strides and produce excellent work at this benchmark because they have access and a seat at the table. As these chief diversity officers push to move towards the third benchmark, they are also frustrated from resistance. It is important to understand that many chief diversity officers who engage in this work do not view themselves as the head Negro in charge or chief absolution officers. They are oscillating on the spectrum, trying to get to the third benchmark that represents the ideal world where white supremacy is eradicated from the system. I refer to these chief diversity officers as chief abolitionist officers. They are not satisfied with maintaining the status quo. They are like cultural espionages, mastering the secrets of a white supremacist system to infiltrate it and ultimately destroy it. My implications for practice are as follows. They are twofold. And for institutions hiring chief diversity officers and for aspiring chief abolitionist officers. Although this study is focused on the experiences of Black chief diversity officers, the implications speak to the CDO role in general. The first one is do not hire a chief diversity officer, and I'll come back to that one because that's the one I want to highlight. The second one is CDOs need support. They also need to be provided emotional support. For those who are looking to aspire to be a chief diversity officer, in my dissertation, I encourage them to aspire to being a chief abolition officer and then the importance of practicing self-care. So I wanted to highlight, don't hire a chief diversity officer. And this is because if institutions want to remain complacent in their attempts to create change, they're just going to do more harm than good. And this is especially important right now in this climate where you're seeing a lot of organizations over the past couple of weeks put out diversity statements. But when you look at their CEOs, their C-suites, those who are in charge, their leadership is mainly white. And so I'm encouraging people, don't hire a CDO if you want to remain complacent, because you're going to do more harm than good. And not because a person of color is a person of color, that doesn't mean that they're a good fit to be a chief diversity officer also. So my recommendations for future studies, my findings reveal that there is more research needed into the lived experiences of Black chief diversity officers. Additional focus can be given to Black chief diversity officers at private and public institutions. Also, given what we know about chief diversity officers and the intersectionality, another recommendation of study could distinguish between Black men and women CDOs. This study focused on the narratives of Black chief diversity officers, but a future study could compare the experiences of other racial and ethnic identities to the findings of this study. And lastly, there remains a gap in the research that has existed at the intersection of diversity in Christian institutions, and further research is also needed in that area. So in conclusion, my desire for this study is to serve as an interrogation and an invitation into the role of chief diversity officers, more specifically Black chief diversity officers who occupy space within a white supremacist system in hopes to dismantle the system. The Oscillation Spectrum is an invitation for higher education practitioners to gain a deeper understanding of the conditions they are placing Black chief diversity officers in when hiring to create limited change. It also serves to bring voice to the experiences of Black chief diversity officers who are oscillating daily while they are fighting against systems of oppression on the academic plantation. And I'll leave you with this quote by Angela Davis. She says, "You have to act as if it were impossible to radically change the world, and you have to do it all the time." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, for that fantastic presentation. Put your claps up in the reactions. Lots of affirmation coming through in the chat as well. Thank you. I have a question for you here from the chat. Can you speak more to the emotional support needed and how we can support our peers if we aren't in leadership without being patronizing?
Whew. Okay, so this is loaded for me because I am a chief diversity officer, and over the past couple of weeks, I have had to lead an institution, lead colleagues when I didn't feel like leading myself, when I saw no hope, when I had to be the light for others. And I just wanted someone to come and ask me, how are you doing? Are you okay? Like, I recognize what is going on in the world. How are you? How can I support you? I wrote a piece and Alex posted it on Facebook, and I kind of talked about the emotional stress that I was under during that week after George Floyd was killed. And then I started to have a lot more colleagues reach out to me because they saw it, and to say, you know, how can I be a support? What can I do to support you in this moment? Even to this day, we're not at my campus going on as business as usual, because I decided in this position at this new institution that I am going to be that chief abolitionist officer. So I'm keeping this conversation at the forefront. And so many people are just texting me randomly, how are you doing? I hope you have a good weekend. Are you taking time out to be with your family? So they're checking on my emotional health, and I really do appreciate that.
Thank you. This is a question about the development of your 4 themes on the slide, the art of balance.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the pacing and the development of those themes? For example, is there a theme that jumped out right away and immediately, where others developed over the course of a longer period of time? Can you speak a little bit to the development of those 4?
Yeah, a lot of the themes jumped out quickly because I too experienced a lot of what my participants said. So a lot of the themes jumped out. What I had to do was narrow them down. I had to narrow down what I thought was of most importance and what was needed during this time to speak to other Black chief diversity officers to validate their experience.
Thank you. Another question here.
Mm-hmm.
What is your advice to CDOs if they want to stay in this space, finding hired to be complicit and not to ruffle feathers? How do we get at the heart of BOTs and cabinet leadership to change?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I have been at an institution where I have oscillated from the HNIC to the chief absolution officer to now the chief abolitionist officer, and it is more freeing on this side. And I will recommend to people to go where you are loved and appreciated, and where your energy can be spent to create change. We're at a time right now where the consciousness of our country has shifted when it comes to these issues, and people want action. People no longer want to hear what we're going to do. People don't want to continue to bring up what organizations need to do to change. They want action. And if your institution is not looking to move in that direction, then you could possibly use your energy someplace else, because a lot of people are looking to hire right now. So you are a hot commodity right now. But just know that this is not for the faint of heart. Doing this role is not the faint of heart. There are a lot of outside pressures and conditions and factors that play a role into this role. And especially as a person of color, you have to carry that weight personally and professionally.
Thank you. Another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you navigate statements such as, I didn't know what to say to you, so I said nothing to you, from non-colleagues of color? Oh, sorry, colleague, yeah. I hope I understand that right. Feel free to correct me in the chat if that was your question.
Now I am looking at people through several different lenses. And it depends on where their silence is coming from. There's this cancel culture right now that is out, canceling people who haven't said anything publicly on Facebook, who hasn't called or texted or anything. I'm a little more empathetic to those who have chosen not to post on social media, because people still have to eat. People are concerned about their jobs, and they are concerned about not rocking the boat. So I'm a little bit more empathetic to those people who haven't spoken out on social media. But for those who have chosen to stay silent and not say anything at all, then I say you're complicit to the system. You're part of the problem, and we need you to speak up. Not only that, as a white person, I need you to use your privilege during this time, because there are things that I can say that people won't hear. But if a white man or a white woman say the same thing that I said, they'll say, oh yeah, I get it. I got it. Using their privilege. I have my own consulting firm. I hired a really good friend of mine. He's a white man. He white-splains for me when I go into other corporations. And so, you know, we give each other this look. And he's like, I got it. And he white-splains to people, you know, so because they can't understand what I'm saying. So I'm using his privilege because he has access to understand them.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Here it is. We have a few coming in.
Make it a good one, Lacey.
So maybe this is the time to say how people can get in touch with you to talk more, if you're open to that, Dr. Hill. But let's see here. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Sounds like campus-specific questions that might be good to follow up with you about. Do you have, maybe we'll end with this, what advice would you have from your experience and from this research for BCDOs to move toward abolitionist or abolitionism? For those who might realize they're on the HNIC end of the spectrum and they want to change.
Yeah, so Dr. Tab, she gave me this quote, I think in class, and it was the first time I ever heard it, and it has stuck with me since she said it, but it's from Cornel West. He says, white supremacy lives in me, and every day I'm dying to it. And so in order to move across that spectrum, you have to recognize the white supremacy that is within you that is causing you to censor yourself, your voice, your position. You have to die to that if you want to be an abolitionist. You have to not be afraid to speak truth to power. To be in uncomfortable situations for others, to no longer center whiteness and white tears and white fears and white guilt in order to move this subject matter ahead. You cannot be afraid. So you have to die to the white supremacy that is within you so that you can be unafraid to do this work.
Thank you, Dr. Hill.
Thank you.
Another round of applause. And I apologize for those who submitted questions in the chat we didn't have time for. Please do follow up.
Feel free to email me.
Awesome, perfect. Okay. Next up, I would like to welcome Dr. Chris Collins to introduce our next presenter.
All right, we got Dr. James Steen up next. When I was growing up, my mom would ask my dad to go to the Piggly Wiggly to get groceries, and he always got in trouble for what he brought back because he did not bring back the brand name stuff. She only wanted the brand name tomato sauce and all the other products. So what is a brand other than a label that is supposed to convey meaning? And so James in this study explores the process of making meaning out of an experience at an institution by using an ethnographic case study method to explore the culture there and how people make meaning of it. So I'll turn it over to you, James.
There we go. It might help if I unmute. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for jumping on. Thank you, Dr. Collins, for that tee up. And the idea of branding, Chris actually gave me permission to explore that a little bit. And it turned out to be something that is not only an interest professionally, but it also kind of hits all the buttons, if you will, in terms of enrollment management, in terms of marketing, in terms of a lot of the things that we're doing from a higher ed perspective. But most of the literature in branding obviously is in the for-profit sector. And the literature that is on the higher ed side did not really get at what we were interested in, which was really kind of how branding meshed with institutional culture. So in terms of defining branding, I love that last definition there. Bob Severe's a legend within higher ed marketing circles, and that's his definition of a brand. But really, to put simply what a brand is, the brand is the meaning that we often attribute maybe to an institution that differentiates it from its competitors. But you can almost even say a brand is more fixed. A brand is what it is. Branding, on the other hand, that's a process of finding and creating and making meaning, as Chris said. So we wanted to explore that. I had a lot of fun digging into this, and ultimately, in terms of the research questions, what we were trying to get at when it was all said and done, the first research question: how is university culture reflected in the brand? So in terms of institutional culture, what does that look like from a branding perspective, right? Second, where is the asymmetry or the alignment? So is the institutional culture aligned with the brand or the branding activities? And then ultimately, what influences those expressions of brand in terms of shaping the culture? So there was, as I mentioned, obviously a gap in terms of what existed in the literature. And then the literature for higher ed really was more about successful brands and institutions that really validated branding as a legitimate topic within higher ed. But there were very few that we could find that really talked about institutional culture and how branding activities ultimately impacted institutional reputation. So I ended up doing a case study. I spent a week on a campus of a CCCU institution, conducted 24 interviews. They were all faculty, staff, and administration. I wanted to do a student focus group, but we weren't able to really set that up and get that teed up in a way, but had a interesting experience and attended a lot of events on campus that week. I went to their chapel twice. I went to a scholarship banquet and really just dove into the deep end of the pool in terms of gathering data and being a part of that institution for about a week. So the themes that really emerged when it was all said and done, their institutional values, they call them their core values. Their 4 core values in a lot of ways are synonymous. With the university mission. They're a short, pithy way to basically communicate their mission statement via these 4 core values. The 4 were pursuing excellence, Christ first, caring community, and future focused. And so we took an interesting approach, and I really took a deep dive into understanding those 4, and I'll talk a little bit more about what some of the participants said within those. The second theme that emerged was institutional personas, specifically the president. Not only the former president, who had been at the institution for many, many years. They'd recently undergone a presidential transition about 4 or 5 years ago, and the new president that came in literally just stepped in and continued not only to promote those core values, but to even kind of take them to the next level, if you will. So it was an interesting finding, if you will, to see that the presidents were a huge part of not only the culture, but of that branding process itself. And then finally, the institutional affiliation, the Christian mission of the institution. They were very, very committed to their denominational affiliation, and their whole purpose, if you will, was about the integration of faith and learning. And most of us in higher ed, especially if you're in Christian higher ed, you've heard integration of faith and learning probably almost thrown around ad nauseum, but I can guarantee you it was something that they believed in heavily and pursued diligently and aggressively. So these were the three themes that really came to the surface in terms of the big three findings. Ultimately, implications for practice and what kind of came out of this on the back end. Branding coherence is something that was one of the things probably driven more so by the core values. The case study institution was very coherent and very consistent in how they promoted these 4 core values. They did so directly at times, they did so indirectly, but it was really those core values that drove all of their branding activities. In fact, everyone that I interviewed at the institution could not only recite the core values, but many of them did so without me even ever asking about the core values. When talking about their position at the institution, they automatically went into how their position supports a core value, or sometimes even all 4 of the core values. So these were not just pithy little marketing messages. These were deeply, deeply ingrained into the culture. And promoting those core values, not only coherently and aggressively, but it really worked well for the university, and ultimately that branding coherence felt like that was a model that could be even replicated at other institutions. The whole idea of leveraging presidential leadership, I kind of stumbled onto that by accident, and during I was about halfway through the week, and I was even communicating with Chris Collins along the way, and this whole thing of the presidents, I couldn't escape how impactful the presidents were in this process. And although the former president and the current president had very, very, very different personalities, very, very different leadership styles, the institutional branding strategies were not only dependent on the president, but they ended up inserting their own personality and their own styles into the branding activities that maintain that consistent missional approach. Basically, they leveraged this holistic approach to the mission and the values of the institution without competing or stepping on one or the other. I would assume at many institutions that this whole presidential transitional leadership, you would, a new president, I'm sure there's some risk in assuming the marketing messages or the core values that stemmed from the former presidency, and there probably would be a temptation to abandon and go a different direction, and that's not what happened during this presidential transition. So it really kind of begs the question: not only what can we learn, what are some of the branding implications that we can learn, maybe from presidential transitions, and maybe even what are some of the implications for future presidential searches? Should interviews for upcoming presidents, new presidents, be tied to some branding consistency and coherency? So that was an interesting implication. Third was brand stewardship. And this whole idea of brand stewardship gets at this honoring the past while also maintaining that branding and the brand itself. There's a whole lot around heritage. There's very little research that uses the words brand stewardship. But in this case, the university was extremely clear about who they were and what they were as an institution, really honoring and respecting and even leveraging not only the core values and their mission, but but even their denominational heritage. The university officials were extremely strategic, obviously, about the core values and their beliefs. Then they consistently defined and redefined the brand and positioned the institution with not only external constituents, but internal stakeholders as well. There was literally a full-time staff person who met with and worked with staff members on how they could support the core values. That was a position at the institution. So they were very serious about maintaining or stewarding the brand. So brand stewardship is this idea, this continual process of branding and the activities that go along with that to maintain that brand. Communicating culture with clarity. There are a lot of Christian institutions in higher ed that continually, they have a new brand, a new remarketing campaign on a pretty regular basis. This institution has been saying the same thing for at least, as far back as I could go, at least the last 18 years. They put Christ first in everything, and that is who they are as a culture. It's part of their mission. I mentioned this whole idea of the integration of faith and learning. Ultimately, that's what drives the culture. That's the purpose for the institution. They were very clear about that. On the faculty side, there's a position at the institution that literally works with faculty members to help them figure out how better to integrate faith into their teaching. And so again, they didn't just say or give lip service to this whole idea of integration of faith and learning. They were consistently communicating that internally and externally. I didn't speak to anyone at the university, in fact, who couldn't articulate the importance around integration of faith and learning. So that communicating the culture with clarity was an interesting finding as well. And then finally, success determines a brand strategy. So ultimately, the success for this institution was their mission, right? And maintaining and advancing the mission of the institution for various constituencies across various platforms, whether that be printed pieces or through the website, through social media. They were consistently trying to promote their mission, and that's what defined their success. In fact, the current president made it clear to me that his priorities ultimately are all about the mission. One of the staff members in enrollment management that I interviewed, who had been at the institution for about 30 years and had worked under 3 different presidents. This was his 3rd president to work under. He mentioned to me last year that the institution actually missed their enrollment goal by a pretty significant margin. And instead of the president coming down on admissions, his questions were, did we do what we said we were going to do? Did we advance the mission? Did we ultimately abide by the core values? And if we did that, then we were successful. So he even determined and really clearly defined for that team what is success. And success was not necessarily record enrollment, right? Success was, did we uphold the mission and vision of the institution? So the culture, the faculty, staff, administration, they're all on board with that. And from that defines success for the institution. So ultimately, the takeaways that I would say, language and words matter. Institutional stories, the narrative, the things we do, the things we say, those ultimately become the brand and define what the brand is. we're all involved in that process, right? And so what we say matters deeply. The institutional culture is critical because ultimately we buy into and support what we believe in. So if the institutional culture is something that we can believe in, then ultimately it's something we can be a part of and that we can promote and that we can consistently abide by. And then ultimately, all of us contribute to branding the institution. So branding is not just a marketing thing. Yes, there are potentially employees at your institution, at my institution, whose sole responsibility is promotion of the brand, whose sole responsibility is communicating with internal and external constituents. But ultimately, it's not just their job, right? That's one part of it. But ultimately, we have to deliver on the promise of the brand. And all of us are part of that branding process, of the action part of ultimately communicating and living out the brand internally as well as externally. So on that note, I will turn it back over to Lacey and see if there are any questions out there.
Thank you, Dr. Steen. Applause for you. I don't know where my reactions, there they are. Okay, put up my applause. Thank you for that presentation. We have time for just a couple questions here. The first question for you, did any of the faculty and staff you interviewed talk about the correlation between their strong brand, enrollment, and retention during challenging enrollment for Christian higher education, even pre-COVID, the challenges we had even pre-COVID?
Oh, they did. That was a topic of concern that they were very aware. I don't know who had coached the faculty especially, but they were very aware of this kind of enrollment cliff that we're going to be facing in the next 3 to 6 years, that enrollment is falling off. They were very aware of the challenge of Christian higher education and the fact that this current generation may not value Christian higher ed as much as prior generations. So yes, they were very aware of the challenges and even spoke to some of those concerns themselves. And I thought it was interesting that some of the faculty, even with the presidential transition, even preferenced that they had a lot of respect for the former president who had really kind of put the university on the map, if you will, but they really felt like this new president that had recently started was going to be able to help them weather that storm and was positioned to do that. One of them even called the new president a budget hawk, of really having the ability to lead the institution through that. So yes, they were very aware of the challenges that are facing Christian higher ed.
Thank you, Dr. Steen. A final question for you, and it's a two-parter. First part, how do you honor a brand that's steeped in past racism?
Mm-hmm.
And to follow up on that, in what ways can you honor the past while speaking the truth of a tarnished past to the intersectionality of differences such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, etc.?
Yeah, and I think that is something that there definitely was tension in terms of what the brand is and what the brand could be, and there were, I would say, some faculty, even some staff who had been at the institution for long enough that they were oblivious to it. There were, I would say, 2 or 3 who had worked at other institutions, and their perspectives on the university and even its denominational affiliation, they were challenged by that. And so again, I don't know that there are easy answers in how do we deal with those historical systemic challenges but I think there are more of us who can appreciate, who can certainly help navigate the institutions through some of these challenges. I don't know that this institution, because they are so focused on who they are and maintaining that, I don't know that they're ready for systemic change. Although, you know, in several, you know, settings, there were very few. I mean, I could count in chapel, for example, just sitting around me. I did not count any more than maybe a dozen students of color sitting in proximity to me. There were faculty who lamented that, and there were faculty who got it. So I think, again, I don't know that there are easy answers to those questions, but I think there are definitely some opportunities for many of you to take this to the next level and hopefully do some research that can study how do we now change what has been our historical past going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Steen. The phrase "ready or not, here systemic change comes" is what came to my mind. Appreciate this. Okay, so I want to invite Dr. Laurie Schreiner and welcome her to introduce our next presenter.
All right, our final presenter is Dr. Cindy Derrico, who is a member of the 2011 cohort. She's Associate Vice President for Student Affairs at Cal State Channel Islands. And she was a member of my research team as we first ventured into mixed methods. And it was such a privilege to publish an article with her even before she was in dissertation phase. Her dissertation truly represents a labor of love as she diligently submitted and was approved at 14 Cal State campus systems through their IRB process. So that is the astonishing accomplishment there. And then went on to collect data from over 1,600 students within a 4-week period of time, right before we all shut down for COVID-19. Cindy has been the most courageous, persistent student I've seen, as life kept throwing her curveballs through all of this process. Cindy, I am so proud of you and your good work and can't wait for you to share it with the rest of our students.
Thank you very much, Lori. I really appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to share my presentation with you. All right, there we go. So it's good to be with you. Thank you so much, Lori, for that wonderful introduction. I definitely support and all of the care and attention you gave me throughout the dissertation process. My dissertation title is Thriving on Campus, the Role of Residency Type in First-Year College Students' Intent to Persist. So the problem and gap that, by way of introduction, that I want to give you is the central problem that my study sought to address was the tension between the costs associated with living on campus and its value as a contributor to student success and retention for first-year students attending public institutions. There's been voluminous research, of course, over many decades about the value of living on campus, but more recently, researchers have explored that question more deeply because of the changes in college conditions and college students, and so my study contributes to that literature. In addition, my study fills a gap in the literature through its use of thriving as a mediator in examining the contribution of on-campus residency and to various residential learning programs to intent to re-enroll among first-year students at public institutions. No other studies have fully explored these relationships and this population. My research questions are outlined there on the screen, but generally among first-time public university college students, what are the pathways to intent to re-enroll as mediated by thriving and its various known predictors? And more specifically, I examined the unique pathways of each of the 4 residency types for commuters, those in general assignment, those in living learning communities, and also those in living learning communities and in theme communities. Both theme communities and living learning communities, or LLCs as they're commonly referred to, offer programming and support around a common theme or academic interest. But LLCs are differentiated in that within those programs, students are also co-enrolled in at least one academic course. So my research design and participants, you'll see some information here on the slide. My conceptual framework was thriving as a holistic measure of student success and an indicator of academic, social, and psychological well-being. And I used the thriving quotient for data collection, as Lori said, at 14 different public institutions in the West. I also used, I would like to think I mastered, but I certainly did my best in mastering structural equation modeling and developed both, the omnibus model for this study, as well as individual models for each of the 4 residency types that were explored. You can see in the demographics here that across the 14 public institutions that I studied, women, white students and students from selected institutions are overrepresented in my study. Latinx students are underrepresented according to the populations that are enrolled in the university system. First generation students, students from families with incomes less than about 60,000 are about similar to those in the general population. And then students from selected institutions are also overrepresented in my sample. Let's see here. Next, I get to talk about results and discussions. I'm very excited about that. And I'm going to use a little bit of animation here to share with you a little bit about how I explored these effects in each of my models. So the experience of living on campus had the largest effect of any of the control variables on the endogenous variable predicting campus involvement. So you'll see that there. And then campus involvement mediated the effect of living on campus to institutional integrity, to psychological sense of community, and also to thriving. And those ultimately contributed about 7.2% of the variation in intent to re-enroll. And did that? Yes, it did show that. Through, in my omnibus model, that was through psychological sense of community made that contribution. In the model, sorry, let me go back. In that model and in the open assignment and LLC models, the sizable relationship between PSC and thriving left very little room to uniquely contribute to intent to re-enroll. What I found was that there was, I called it sort of a struggle for dominance in each of the models over whether it would be thriving or psychological sense of community that would directly predict intent to re-enroll, but there wasn't a model where both of them were direct contributors. The cementing influence in the omnibus model of involvement was very, very important also to, as a pathway for students to thriving and intent to re-enroll. Now I want to talk to you about each of the 4 residency type models now, and let me make sure all of them are showing so that you can see them as I'm presenting. So as I mentioned, I also did unique path models for each of the 4 residency types, and the effects on intent to re-enroll increase. You'll see as the intensity of the residency types increases across the 4 residency types. So the effects for commuters are significantly lower than those who live on campus in open assignment, in theme communities, and then the largest effect is seen for those in living learning communities. All of the models, though, explained a sizable amount of the variation in thriving, and the largest of which was seen among our theme community participants. Now, for commuters, Latinx students and first-generation students are overrepresented, as are students whose families earn less than $60,000 a year. So family income was the largest direct predictor of intent to re-enroll. Thus, income served not only as a potential barrier to continuing college, but also limited their access to the benefits of living on campus that indirectly supported higher levels of thriving and persistence. A sense of community made a stronger direct contribution to thriving for commuters than for those who live on campus. Thus, this supported for commuters their interaction and satisfaction with faculty, making the classroom a really key context for building confidence in the institution and leading to a greater sense of connection and belonging. In the next residency type, open assignment, these are students who were not in LLCs or theme communities. They tended to be from less selective institutions, and there were 4 direct effects on intent to re-enroll: high school grades, gender, involvement, and psychological sense of community. In this model, thriving did not predict intent to re-enroll. The direct relationship between involvement and intent to re-enroll for open assignment was unique in this model. It didn't appear in any of the others. And in the others, the largest effects of involvement were mediated through institutional integrity and also through PSC. Thus, the reduced cohesion of student involvement yielded smaller effects on the perception that the university was walking its talk or in sense of community. For them, more simply, the more involvement they had, the more likely they were to say that they would return in the fall. And this was supported through their interaction and their satisfaction with faculty. Notably then, as student-faculty interaction and involvement's effects grew, their effects on psychological sense of community grew as the intensity of residency types increased, the strength of the relationship between integrity and PSC decreased. The next model was theme communities. Among them, this was where I had the largest variation in terms of the structure and implementation across the 4 institutions. There was a lot more uniformity in how those were implemented in the other 3 residency types. The relationship between psychological sense of community and thriving was most sizable for students in theme communities, though the lower levels of reported student-faculty interaction seemed to suggest that their stronger sense of community tended to come from their involvement and interaction with their peers. This finding seems to make sense though, because theme communities did not have an embedded faculty component through the classroom, and so they didn't have as many structured opportunities for peer connections through the classroom, and it was those peer connections outside the class that strengthened their common interest in the theme community. And then the last of my models for living learning communities, there was a significant difference in involvement levels for students over commuter and open assignment students. And this played a larger role in their levels of thriving and in their intent to re-enroll. Involvement did not appear as a predictor of integrity in this model. And I think that that was due to the larger role that was played by faculty for students in LLCs, which led to student-faculty interactions, or the more sizable contribution of student-faculty interaction to the student's perception that the institution was actions were congruent with their mission. In LLCs, the effects of interaction with faculty and participation in activities and organizations had the largest direct effects on PSC when you compare it to all of the other models, and moderating the strength of the relationship between institutional integrity and PSC. Although the effect on intent to re-enroll is still modest in this model, even as it was larger than all the others, I think that it is sizably larger than the others and thus remains noteworthy. I want to now share with you some of the implications for research and practice. The first one I want to share, I got some confidence to share this through Dr. Kim, who was part of my committee, and that was the importance or the opportunity we have in higher education research to include residency type as we parse out the various in-college effects for students. There is plenty of research that supports the idea that there is a wide variation of the effects of living on campus for students. And as I mentioned earlier, my study contributes to those outcomes. And I think it may be time for us to parse out the difference between students, not just that they live on campus, which is a common question in higher education research, but really to dig a little bit deeper and understand where they live on campus, what kinds of engagements they have when they live on campus, so we can better understand how those contribute to a wide variety of higher education outcomes for students. And then the other I'll highlight in terms of implication is the importance, I think, that my study illuminates in investing in living learning communities over theme communities and open assignment. In my own personal experience in working with these various residency types, it takes a lot more energy and effort to invest in coordinating the classroom activities with assignments in the residence hall and then coordinating programs and engagement experiences for students. However, I think that investment is worth it because of the significant effects that my study demonstrated, but also for the opportunity of solidifying important relationships with faculty and also supporting the opportunities for students to be engaged with peers in academic interactions, which support their thriving as students at the institution, but also their intent to re-enroll. And then in terms of recommendations for future research, I just want to highlight one or two here. And one of them, I think I have the confidence to share this through my chair, Lori Schreiner, is there's been a lot of research about living learning communities or residential learning communities as they're known more broadly in the literature. And I think there's an opportunity for us to examine in a controlled experiment, placing students in those learning communities and doing that randomly so that we can really see what the effects are. This could be particularly beneficial and possible in institutions where there's a large interest in those programs and limited seats, for example. So those may be able to be randomly assigned rather than assigned based on the date of the application or other criteria that may be used in evaluating them. And then another one that I think is important is examining the unique path models of each of the 5 subscales of thriving. Because my study focused on the overall construct of thriving, the second order factor, I was not able to dig in as deeply to the effects that each of the 5 subscales may contribute to intent to re-enroll and also to thriving in general. So I think that exploring those would also be beneficial. And then in closing, I come to the end of my presentation. That's the end of my prepared comments. But I wanted to just take a brief moment here to thank my committee members, Dr. Lori Schreiner, my chair, also Dr. Young Kim, who was my excellent methodologist, and my subject matter expert, Dr. Vaughn Stange. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Derrico. Let's put up our applause if you can. You've got your reactions there. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So we have time for a couple questions. Here's the first for you. What do you believe the thriving psychological impact is on non-white students?
Well, I think has been explored in many other studies. I think it's one of the ways in which we can even the playing field for students of color, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, because we know that thriving is one of the things that equalizes the experience of pre-college factors. So that would be one of the major contributions I would indicate.
Thank you. And a follow-up, couple questions coming in related to COVID-19. Housing and COVID-19 are an interesting pair right now.
Indeed.
Yeah, yes. So what are your thoughts? What are recommendations you might have for residence life staff given your findings? What advice might you give to administrators about living learning communities and housing in general during these times?
Certainly. And I do want to, I think you probably know this, but just so I give the disclaimer that I didn't get to study this, but I am getting to live it in my everyday life in my job right now. And so one of the things that I would recommend and that we have explored institutionally is because we are addressing the housing experience very differently right now, and promoting it isn't even the way I would articulate it. I think that on at our public institutions, we are there for students. We want to make sure that students who face housing insecurity and other things have a place to go, as opposed to promoting it for all of the many benefits that it offers that I just got done talking about in my presentation. So one of the things that I would recommend is that you look at still assuring that students are engaged in these learning communities, right? So this is an important implication of my study for commuters, for example, that they be engaged in learning communities. So even though there may be fewer students living on campus during this period of time, it's a wonderful opportunity to make sure that we engage as many first-year students in learning communities across the campus. And I know for us, we're looking at ways that we can still assign the few who will be with us on campus to be living close together. So they'll still have some opportunity for engagement in that way. But I would definitely recommend the use of learning communities in the curriculum to support student learning and a greater connection to the institution.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for your good questions, and Cindy for your presentation.
Thank you.
Now to bring things to a close, we are surprising our graduates with the first ever Ph.D. graduation video. So please join me in celebrating with our graduates by watching this video together. To God be the glory. Amen to all of you, and hopefully I can do this right. I want to offer my congratulations to the 2020 graduates, David Dufault Hunter, James Steen, Redgina Hill, and Cindy Derrico. We are so deeply proud of you for all of the odds that you've overcome, the obstacles you've encountered, particularly this year with COVID-19, disrupting all of our best laid plans for your hooding. We look forward to your presentations and to celebrating with you in person in January when you're hooded, and we wish you all the very best as you go out into the world as proud PhD students from APU. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Cindy, Regina, David, and James on reaching this huge milestone. We are very proud of you for your accomplishment in dissertation as well as your hard work and perseverance you have shown during your dissertation journey. I know most of you have been interrupted by COVID-19 in the later part of your dissertation journey, but you went through it and you made it. And I believe that now you will be a very happy virus for your family. We know that every end has a new beginning. As you look forward to your next stage in your life with PhD, I wish you all the best for the future that lies ahead. Congratulations again.
Let me add my congratulations to each of you as 2020 graduates. Wow, what a remarkable accomplishment in an extraordinary time. What a time to be alive. My word to you is this: as you move forward in your life, doing the good work that you are called and purposed to do, may you bear witness to the words of Ida B. Wells, one of our greatest freedom fighters, who says, "The way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them." Good wishes to each of you. Congratulations.
Congratulations to the class of 2020 on earning your doctoral degree. This is an amazing accomplishment, and with great power comes responsibility. And now you've emerged into a changing world, and you all go out there, be change agents, be leaders in our field of higher ed. Much respect.
Well, congratulations everyone who received their doctorate in this unforgettable year 2020. You are now a doctor. And I pray that when you hear that title, God would remind you of the responsibility you have to use your gifts, your intellect, your training for the betterment of society. I hope that you would make an impact in whatever sphere of influence you have. And I pray that you would do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Congratulations once again.
Dear graduates, we are so proud of you. You made it. You worked hard, you persevered, and you got it done. One of my favorite authors calls research an act of devotion. And I pray for you that you will take this experience and in your lives, your careers, and your further research, you will make it an act of devotion. DDH, Cindy, Regina, and James, you have done great work. We're so proud that you came to APU, and we're proud to call you APU graduates. Thank you for all you've done, and congrats again.
Wow, 4 of our superstars crossing the platform. Your families are so proud of you. Our faculty are proud of you. And I feel like a proud mama. So thankful for the day that you have run the race and will cross the finish line and present your dissertations and be awarded your doctorates. It just makes me very happy. So I think back, I'm thinking of Regina and early conversations we had in DDH coming into the program, both of you with such a big commitment to social justice and diversity and enriching our classrooms. I can think of the conversations we had on East and West Campus, DDH, about DACA, and Regina, your contributions in the classroom, and then James, all that you brought from your senior level position, your cabinet level knowledge into the classroom for all of us to benefit from. It makes me happy. And Cindy, the same, such a voice of maturity and experience in the CSU system and your key role over at Channel Islands. It's just been a gift to have all 4 of you in our doctoral program.
So thank you for joining us today. We are so proud of our grads, and we've recorded this, and we will also send our graduates the video. And great job, great job. We are so proud of you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank y'all.
Thank you. That was such a great video.
That was a fun video.
I think we should all
Thanks, everybody.
our mics so everybody can hear the thunderous applause.
Yeah.
Yes.
Woo-woo.
Congratulations.